Eric here with 30 by 40 Design Workshop. We're continuing on with the studio design project, and we are now at the point where we're going to take the plan diagrams and overlay them on the existing site. The existing site here, you can see, is shown north facing up. We have woodland at the entire perimeter here, and a lot of this is wetland actually. You can see I've diagrammed where the existing driveway entry is and the existing house entry is. This red box indicates where we currently park. I think the candidate building site is sort of in this zone, and what we're going to do is overlay these plan diagrams that we generated in the last video on the site. And what this is going to do is tell us, which of these plan orientations and layouts best matches the existing context. Now, if we take the barn plan as an example, there's studio space on one side and there's practice space on the opposite side. And you basically enter to the center of the plan. And this is a pretty flexible plan. It's very efficient from a circulation standpoint. And as we start looking at how it might orient on the site, it starts to suggest that this seems to be a pretty good candidate location. It starts creating these sort of spaces in between structures, which I really like. You can see that we have now a zone here between those two buildings. We have an arrival zone here, and you quite neatly sort of filter into what's a pretty public building, basically. So I could see this plan working quite well in this configuration. As we start turning at 90 degrees, you can start seeing, the different opportunities that are suggested. So if we think about how the studio might be positioned to look out into the woods here, or the music space could sit on the driveway. There could actually be sliding doors here to open this up as a sort of practice or a stage space on here. In the existing cleared area, that seems quite nice to me. It's got the long flank of the building picking up solar gain. The hard thing about this is as we push it further this direction, the land starts to slope off. So I really want to kind of stay within this defined courtyard that we already have developed. So if I'm talking about the best orientation for the barn style plan, I think it's probably here or here. Here we start aligning with the end of the building, so I don't love that as much. We're arriving to the gable and then we have to reconfigure the driveway. So with the barn, I'm starting to say this is probably a pretty good orientation for this. It's perpendicular to the house. The long flank is not picking up the solar gain, but because the woods are so close here, there's not a lot of solar gain to be had. So barn plan looks like a pretty good option. We'll set that aside and we'll move over to the weighted entry plan. Now this plan looks like it might be able to actually work pretty well in this kind of a configuration here, or this kind of a configuration where you actually come by let's say this is the studio space, you come by that and you end up in the music space. Now the music space in that configuration would have a view out to the woods, so maybe it makes sense then to flip the studio here and put the music practice space here. Again, we have some problems structurally with this plan in terms of how we're circulating by the music space. And when I start to look at this, how it fits on the site, I don't see a lot of great sort of candidate locations that make a lot of sense. If I arrive here, again, I have to reconfigure the driveway. If I bring it over here, it seems difficult to find the entry on this. If I orient it like this, that seems to make some sense, but then it's putting the private music space in the most public part of the site. So this plan, in contrast to the barn plan, has some problems. I think it's not an ideal plan for a lot of different reasons. Now, this weighted plan is a variation of the barn plan, and I actually think this one could work quite well in a number of different configurations. If we flip it over like this, for example, then we start to think about, okay, if this is more related to the house as a music practice space, then let's set it on the house side here. And then the studio space ends up orienting back to the woods, and there's a clear division of arrival, public space for clients and meetings, and private space from here on out. So actually I like this plan orientation. I think this one could probably work quite well if we can figure out how to divide the space in a way that makes sense for the practice. Now the last plan is looking at a very similar one to the second one we looked at, with a center entry here, which then subdivides this entry space bisects this entry space into two spaces. I didn't like this plan for a number of reasons, but as we start overlaying on the site, some of those reasons really become apparent. As you're bisecting this space, now you have a space, if we're starting to layer ideas of public and private, develop these gradations, This, by dividing this space, means that this is going to be oriented toward a private view and also a public view. I can't see that working for either the studio or the music. The other problems were that the music space or the studio space needs to pass through one or the other, and it effectively reduces the square footage available to use in a small footprint. So for many reasons, I think this plan is sort of less viable. Perhaps in an orientation like this, it may make the most sense where a studio piece would sit on the more public end of the site and the private space would sit there. Here you're entering the driveway right at the studio, so that could potentially work, but I don't like the spaces that it creates in between. I really like the sort of dynamic interplay between elements that happens when we start looking at the barn plan in this relationship. So if we assume let's assume for a moment that we're going to develop the barn plan as our sort of candidate plan. Okay, so now we've chosen the barn as our sort of prototype floor plan. We like what it does on the site. We know the plan inside can work. Now, how do we take that barn form and turn it into a floor plan that's usable? What we want to do first off is sort of think about the building typology. So a barn was typically subdivided into 3 spaces. The center bay was used by the farmer to pull the wagon into the center here, and then each end had hay lofts up above, followed by animal storage and grain storage and things like that down below. So if we take that as just a general ordering principle, because architects like order, we start to establish a basic sort of rhythm of spaces here. So you can see our center space here is going to be our open area probably, and we're talking about having lofts for storage on either end, and so I think that works pretty well in this plan diagram too. On one side we'll have the music area, and the other side we'll have the studio area. So that seems to work out quite nicely. Now, developing a grid as an ordering system is a great place to start. That overlays an underlying order, which then we can sort of violate and break as necessary. Now we have this plan set up like this. We know that as it sits on the site, the existing house is over here, north is that way on the page in this particular diagram. It's just easier to draw like this. And so then we want to start thinking about how we layer on things like storage. So architects will typically set up, let's say, one singular zone for that. And in this case, for the studio, it could be bookshelves, it could be a work desk space here. Here it could be storage for books that we would access during client meetings. This would be the sort of entry focus and the meeting area. And here it could be recording equipment. Each one of these divisions in this structural order starts assigning this sort of layering of ordering principles on top of it. Now, we also have additional functions of storage that need to happen outside of the studio space. On one end, we want to fit a lawnmower and our generator. We talked about that in the early exercise, and these dimensions come from that initial ordering exercise. So we set those early on. So we know that's enough space to house our lawnmower here, our generator and our lawnmower, and that will work out well. Have some doors there. This end, then, closest to the house, I think we should put firewood here. And again, we've sized this so that we know we can fit the proper amount of firewood in here. And this can actually be an open bay at the end of the structure. So now we have this zone and this zone as nice ordered storage areas that sort of bookend the plan. Now we also want to be thinking about how this ties to the concept. And with a barn, when I think about a barn, I think about something that has a high ratio of wall area to opening. So there's a lot of wall versus the small amount of opening. A lot of times you'll see barns with these sort of tiny little windows, lots of wall area, because you don't want to lose a lot of heat, and there's not a huge need for a lot of light in there. And then this center opening is big enough to allow the sort of wagon in, and then the loading and unloading of the hayloft. So all of these things start to suggest barn. And what I like about thinking about this as a barn form is we can start integrating this into our concept of the building being this lens for seasons by thinking about this center bay as being completely glazed. So if we think about that as being totally glazed, and these ends are then way more solid, it allows us to be sitting inside and looking out these sort of large apertures. And these apertures are a way of sort of connecting us back to the landscape. And when we think about starting to develop the elevations, as I think about, let's say this side, for example, which faces out to a nice woodland view, if we have this proportion building, and this is looking at the side elevation of it, what if on this side we create this sort of slot window? And so that as you're entering the building, you're standing up, your sight line is sort of in this zone, but when you sit down at the conference table, which would sort of sit at this elevation, your eye level moves down to this zone. And so you have this sort of framed opening that you view from the inside. You'll be viewing the wooded landscape outside. And as that changes with the season and the leaves change color, it's this sort of ever-changing pictorial view of the forest and the landscape. And there are other ways to do this too. You know, we can also add these sort of pivoting hinged panels that would maybe cover those openings, modulate the light. We can start thinking about, you know, how we might cut holes in the roof and think about skylights and ways to connect back to the sky. On the flip side, where we have these sort of this larger door opening, we can think about how panels might close over that or modulate that, or maybe the panels change material with the season. Maybe they're fabric colored in the spring and they're more solid in the winter. All of these things layer onto what is a simple extruded gable shape, but they start to reinforce and bolster our concept of the building acting as a lens for the seasons. Now, this basic plan diagram eventually evolves into something that's, you know, much more fixed in space. And, you know, as you see with this floor plan here, I've got a fixed dimension here, I've got a fixed dimension here. I'm starting to divide it into actual bays and how big, you know, these rooms actually are and what makes sense, how we might sort of enter here, some ideas about connecting back to the water element on the site, and looking at the sort of proportion and shape of the building. Having these storage flanks on the end really helps to reinforce this idea of a barn. Now, what I've done from here, having developed this floor plan, I went and built a model. And I think in the next video, we're going to look at that model and look at how it has evolved and, you know, some of the plan changes that were necessitated based on building this model and looking at how these actual spaces interact and taking the model out on the site so we can look and see how the sunlight affects it. There's a couple of changes, important changes that came about as a result of building that model, and I'll walk you through that in the next video.